Hi, everybody. In our first session this week, we talked some about what it is that makes a state unique, what is the components, or what are the components of a nationalist kind of review. In the second session, we want to talk a little bit about belief systems in security. These belief systems, including religion, culture, nationalism, ideology, and other things, really help us understand how states are going to behave, and I think to a very great extent understand how nationalism plays into the overall idea of a state. So the first question I suppose one might ask is, does it matter? And I think what we have here, and sort of identified in the little text below the slide, is an indication of three instances in which appreciating culture, appreciating religion matters a lot. In each of these three instances, we found massive power engaged against relatively minor power with, relatively speaking, disastrous results. And in each instance, I would argue to you, our failure, or the failure of the Soviet Union, and oftentimes the failure of almost anybody to understand local cultural factors, understanding the religions of the local populations, are a disaster. And so I think we do need to pay quite close attention to those. This is a list of sort of definitions of all of the items here. And I don't want to try and get into any of them, and certainly it's not our intent here to try and make any of us overnight intellectuals or overnight experts in any one of them. But I do think you need to understand what each of these are and how they behave if you are going to be effective in any of the conflicts that we seem to be finding ourselves in, especially since the end of the Cold War, but really dating back to the end of the Second World War and probably as far back as the Korean War. That is clearly a derivative of the World War II, but we went from Korea to Vietnam and then a host of places in the Middle East. I think that if we had understood these four factors a lot better, we would have been much better served. So, what are all of these things? Well, ideology is important. It was the defining ideas, if you will, of the Cold War. And it says these are the way the world operates. When you believe in some ideology, whether it be capitalism or communism or socialism or something else, then it tells you why it is that a government will behave the way it does, and it also gives you some predictive capability to understand what's likely to happen in the future. And the legitimacy of any particular government and any particular action is actually very, very decisive. When the United States decided that it needed to invade Afghanistan in search of Osama bin Laden after the attacks on 9/11, virtually the entire world agreed that that was a legitimate thing for us to do. Virtually all of the members of NATO, for example, supported us, and this includes those that we would expect would support us, like Great Britain, and those that lots of times we think might not support us, like France. On the other hand, when we decided that it was important to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein and invade Iraq, there was no comparable legitimacy, at least on the global stage, and many of those nations which had supported us in Afghanistan withdrew their support or withheld it when we went forward into Iraq. So the legitimacy of a nation is extraordinarily important, and it has a lot to play with nationalism. I think that the easiest way to try and understand that is the rising sense of nationalism in China. There is a huge sense across all of China that the idea of the nation of China is extraordinarily important, that it is rooted in a very, very long history, and that history provides legitimacy to the government. But the government deal with the people is that it will continue to provide economic benefits And as long as it continues to do so, it will be viewed as legitimate. If it fails to provide certain benefits to the population, and those now include not only economic growth, but environmental protection and other things, as long as it continues to provide those things, then the government of the Chinese Communist Party is viewed as legitimate. If, in fact, it were no longer able to provide those goods to the people, there is a real sense in Chinese history that it would have lost its legitimacy to rule and would be perfectly normal for the government to fail. I'm not claiming, of course, that that is likely to happen anytime soon, but it will begin to let you see how the CCP uses nationalism to boost its legitimacy, but how at the same time that sense of nationalism provides certain limits on what the CCP can and cannot do.